listening to Radio Prospero. A new edition of the Tiscan podcast starts now.
All right, so it's been a little while, but we're finally back, and we're basically on the verge of 11th edition. I've got Tom here. A lot of people know him as Niv. Has been playing Thousand Suns for quite a while. A lot in 10th edition, right?
Yes, quite a bit in 10th edition. Pretty much since 10th edition launch, I've been on almost entirely Thousand Suns.
Same.
So yeah,
Same. Yeah, it was pretty much a whole edition of just Thousand Suns and a couple breaks with a couple other armies just to kind of get a little bit of a break. But I don't know about you, but towards the end of this edition, it just kind of got a little bit stale, a little bit, I don't want to say boring because there were still elements of creativity and we were still seeing some new stuff through some of the data slates. But, in general, it just kind of felt like, yeah, by about halfway through 2025, it kind of was like, this is 10th edition. It is what it is. Like the
yeah. I
codex has
think.
settled down. We pretty much knew what the lists were for Thousand Suns, all that stuff.
Well, and the second part of that is like the lists, at least from Grand Coven, from the Index to Coven, didn't really change all that much, nor did the playstyle. And I didn't play much of anything else besides Coven because I like to I'm here for the spells as a Thousand Suns player, so Phalanx didn't really appeal to me, but it's a good way to play, obviously. But if you're playing the Grand Coven list, then you're kind of playing the same list you were playing since we launched 10th. You have the Terminators back, but I played those for a good year anyway at the beginning of the edition, so it is a little stale. I do think that my big thing that I've found that has helped me out is that I do, as much as it can be annoying sometimes, I do enjoy the spellcasting mechanic. I think it gives the gambling kind of could go crazy, could completely whiff, keeps it exciting for me. But I agree, it has gotten a bit stale. There was a time there after the Codex, we had the first patch where we got a bunch of really bad points increases. And I just basically said, I don't want to deal with this. It feels so anemic. So I played a good 6 months of Space Marines, and then we got some points back, and I was able to find joy in the army again. So that was nice. But yeah, I agree. It's gotten a little stale, but I think everybody's feeling that way at this point.
Yeah, I mean, 3 years of any edition, it's kind of just like this is the time period you get to where, the game is pretty much what the game is going to be, and I don't know
Yeah.
whether GW will ever speed that up. I think they're probably handcuffed by their product release cycles that they've got, but yeah, you get to about this point in any edition. The same thing happened in ninth edition, where you just kind of get towards the
Mhm.
end, and it's kind of like, yeah, we and ninth edition was actually funny in that regard because that was right when we got the Psychic Awakening, was like right at the end of the
Yeah.
edition, and so we only got maybe about 3 months to actually play new T Suns with that, and then we just moved
Yep.
on to tenth edition.
Yeah, I
So
played I
yeah,
played a
go
little
ahead.
bit in ninth. I played in Nephilim ninth and then into Arcs of Omen as well. So I kind of hopped on right when the Codex dropped. So I didn't really get the first half, but it was definitely the kind of the big boom with the Codex, and then also the Demons Codex, obviously. But then same thing, like after all the codexes came out, and they tried to spice it up with Arcs of Omen, but obviously we kind of got shot in the foot by that
Right.
back then. But yeah, I think the thing is if I feel like if we'd gotten something in this Eye of Terror end of the edition campaign thing, if we'd gotten maybe I don't know, a cultist unit that was nice for us. The Defiler is great, but it would have been nice to have a little more a new detachment or new way to play that might have made things a little more fun. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think I agree. It's just a matter of end of the edition after all the courses are out. It's hard to not get stale. I agree.
Yeah. What was your thought on 10th edition as a whole? You played ninth edition a little bit.
Yeah.
Just if you take your
So
Thousand Suns hat off.
I think in general, so I played about a year and a half of competitive ninth edition. And so I got a decent look at the kind of later parts of it. And I think compared to my experience in ninth edition and my experience in 10th edition. I feel like 10th overall was, from a like macro standpoint, more balanced than ninth was. Obviously, we had moments where certain armies just took off. Eldar at the beginning of the edition, and then again more times. And then you had like a couple courses like Death Guard came out too cheap, or gosh, like the more Daca orcs. We had some moments, some flashes where it was like this feels like 9th edition again, where you would have like Star Weavers on every table. But I think the really good thing that I saw from as a comparison to 9th edition was that it felt like Games Workshop was more willing to, and as the edition went on, it's got even more so, more willing to make like emergency changes. I feel like in ninth, it was very much like they put the rules out and then it was what it was until the next data slate. So if you got like a crazy broken codex, you had to wait like 3 months and then you finally got a fix. Whereas I feel like in 10th edition, the balance team, with a couple exceptions, has been much faster with like, hey, this is kind of broken. Let's do something to it. Now, they haven't gotten it right every time, but they have been more willing to like poke and prod the meta, which I like. A good example of that is Chick's Honor Guard. We kind of got those, and then pretty quickly they noticed that's kind of crazy, and they toned them back a little bit. Same for things like Death Guard took a while, but once Death Guard got hit, it got toned down. More Daca the same way. A couple weeks of craziness, and they emergency patched it. So that's been a plus. So I think overall, I've enjoyed 10th. These past couple months of Necron craziness have been a bit annoying. I think this is this time of year is like the time they did not quite get their balance stick out right. Like they should have done more to Catan before now. I think they might have finally nerfed them enough points wise where they're not like completely game breaking anymore. But they should have been going up at this many points the previous patch, not this week. But I think overall I've had a pretty good time in 10th. How about you?
Yeah, I would echo exactly what you're saying, and then I think what was good, you said it really well, in that the difference between ninth and tenth is that they just seem to be getting faster and faster at fixing the problems when they're there, and it's kind of this expectation that look, problems will happen. It's impossible with a game that has that many armies in it and that many different combinations and you know interactions in it. It's impossible to think of every single thing that's in there. But eventually, I think they'll staff the balance team enough so that they do catch almost everything, or like 99% of the things that come out from the new rules that are there. What does get interesting is when they seem to, like, the Death Guard was a really good example that you mentioned. It seemed like there was a small period of time in there where it was kind of like, well, Death Guard got those changes, and then everybody was looking at it, and it was just so blatantly obvious that why are these points so low on these units
Mm-hmm.
across the board? And those are the kinds of things that I still kind of question with their balance team, design team, depending on who's actually setting those, or there's a lot of that stuff happening behind the scenes. But I look at that and say that's probably one of the biggest problems, because it still happens, and it's happened
Yeah.
since eighth and ninth edition. But by and large, my opinion of 10th edition has been that it has easily been the best edition that I've played so far, and that's going all the way back to like sixth and seventh edition. I think this has definitely been like the best iteration of 40K that I've had the chance to play. And with Thousand Suns, as much as I didn't like what they did with the army rule, I will still say that they handled Thousand Suns this edition so much better than in previous editions. Just with the balance, they finally are starting. You can see it in the way they're writing the rules, that they're starting to at least think about and try to tackle the problem of the internal interactions that are needed, like psychic
Mhm.
powers having to be able to somehow interact with the rest of the army, or the core army rule needing to be designed in a way that everything in the army benefits from it.
Yeah.
I'm not the biggest fan of the rituals and what they did coming out of that, but it's playable. I don't. It's kind of
Yeah.
like you're not always going to get exactly the rule set that you really want to have. I was more of a preference to the index system with the cabal points. And, I've been over that many times in the past. That had its flaws, but I
Mhm.
preferred more to see a resource system that you could manage through the game rather than something that is more luck driven. Like I really, really hate luck driven armies, in the fact that chaos has always tended to be that. And
Mhm.
thankfully, over like the last edition and a half or so, they've tried to kind of change that. Like we see more damage profiles that are flat damage rather than random
Mhm.
damage in there, those kinds of things. And, competitively speaking, that I think has really helped balance things out where it wasn't kind of like a very, very narrow corridor of units that you could play in chaos and be successful with at tournaments.
Yeah, I think I like what you said. Like, and I think the big thing is that 10th edition, at least from in my area in over in Kansas City, we have had a boom of a bunch of like new players coming in the door with 10th edition, and I think that that might, I hope, have had an effect on the company's ability, like willingness to make those quick changes, because so many new players are coming into the game, and so many people are like more people are playing the game. It's become so much more mainstream since like 10th came out, that I think that's had a big effect. I will agree that I think the armor rule has some flaws. I like the gambling aspect, but I do agree that it's not the best, like from a game design standpoint. Because I think they could have done it better where they make it like, they make it a resource where you have to spend it. And I think that making it a luck based thing, definitely from a fluff standpoint, kind of checks out. We're casting spells, things can go wrong. That makes sense. But I do think that um, I feel like they the current iteration of the rules doesn't quite do the things that I think it should do. Like, I don't like the idea of only casting one try. That feels a little bit like a little too much like feast or famine. Like if you roll poorly, well, I guess I have an armor roll this turn. Or if you roll crazily, well, I guess I have the best armor roll in the game this turn. And it does make it so you can't really plan out what you're doing like other armies can. Um, I don't know what they will do in 11th to change that. I've heard a lot of rumors, I'm sure you have too, that we're getting something like the psychic phase back once the codex has come out. But it does seem like we're stuck with this army rule for at least a few more months of 10th, and also I assume the first half of 11th. We're probably not going to get a dozen codes right away. So we'll see how it goes. I'm hopeful that they make some tweaks to it with 11th and make it a little more consistent. Um, I'd even be fine if they toned down like the power level and made it like more consistent. Just like make it a little less. If you fail, you have a really bad time. But I still enjoy it. I think it's a fun way to play. I love rolling dice, but I think I agree. The big issue is like consistency is not something Thousand Sons has right now, and that's a big reason why I play a lot of teams events with my team. And when we're doing like our matrices and deciding on team composition, Thousand Sons gets passed up, uh, at least traditional Thousand Sons and Grand Coven, over some other options for a 5-man roster, because you just really can't reliably put a score down that's higher than like a 13 or a 14, because yet there's so much potential for you have one bad turn and one bad roll and suddenly you're getting your butt kicked. Whereas if you have that turn going super well and you roll like a 9 instead of a 2, then you turn up with a 20-0. And so that makes it hard to matrix, hard to play in teams. I still think Thus has good teams builds, but consistency would be nice to have on the Emerald front. I agree.
Yeah, I thought in the Codex, at least when I think back to the big teams event we had a couple years ago when we still were running Index and just it would T Suns was in every roster because of the amount of mortal wounds we could deal out. And
Yep.
at least from that standpoint, you had something consistent you could get from it, which meant you could pretty much put them into almost anything, and you'd have some kind of mechanism to compete. And
Hmm.
once they went to like the randomization, and then they downgraded what Doombolt actually can do from a damage perspective, like took the ceiling off a little bit. It kind of, I think just kind of settled the army into more of like a, mid-grade, like you were saying, feast or famine kind of situation. So yeah, it's not the ideal rule set, but I like that people were happy with the feeling of like the psychic phase coming back. And
Mhm.
it seems like the theme going into 11th is a lot more immersion. Like they want to see a little bit better, more interesting interactions on the table where it's not just like these, circles on the board that you stand on and shoot stuff at.
Mhm.
It's been said a lot, how they're going to potentially do the objectives in 11th. But before we get there, I was just going to say, um, you were talking about just the growth of the game, and to I was thinking about that, the perspective from my community, which is down here in Houston, not far from you, but Houston, all through I would say through eighth and ninth edition, Houston was mostly a big enough city that we had an RTT basically every single weekend. And each one was probably, you'd have somewhere between 10 and 20 people at that event. And the challenge was that the city is big enough that we have multiple game stores in different parts of the city, and each of the game stores had to kind of figure out how to rotate their schedule so that, okay, this week is this store, next week is this store, and that way nobody was really stepping on each other's toes. The
Mhm.
growth in 10th edition has been so much in that it caught me off guard when all of a sudden I wasn't able to even attend the RTTs because they were selling out a week ahead of time. And it was absurd because I mean, you had multiple events going on and every single one of them was just basically getting blocked out and sold out. And then
Mhm.
we have like our own team circuit now, because we had so many players get into it, so many teams kind of get together, and it's just been. I can say this is the most growth. I thought eighth edition was crazy when we saw the influx of everybody coming back. This has been nuts here in 10th edition. So I hope it continues in 11th. It's really good to see so many people getting into the hobby. Everybody's got a different way of doing it, so it just kind of makes it so that you can find more and more people you have something in common with.
Yeah, I think I'm hopeful based on what we've seen from the reveals so far, which isn't much to be fair. But what they've shown, I think, has shown a design philosophy of we want to keep the really good parts of 10th and build on them. I'm really excited about the mission that happened recently, the mission reveals about how you can play. You pick like a detachment mission and you can play that mission for basically the entire event, and then you get a different version of your mission.
Yeah.
I think that's gonna, if they can execute that properly, I think that will open the door for a bunch of different flexibility options and list building options that you can build lists and use units that previously wouldn't have been useful at all. Like I think I would imagine like if you wanted to play a Thousand Suns list that was just like all the psychers with all the damage, and you could do a purge the foe mission and just focus on I kill stuff and I also hold 1 or 2 points over the course of the game. I think if they can make it so that all those five options are like balanced enough, or you actually have a way to pick all five, I think that would be a really good change to 10th as a whole. Because I think the biggest problem with 10th that I've experienced is that a lot of the missions and the maps and the games do begin to feel the same. A lot of your deployment and your first turn and second turn are pretty much automatic. You kind of know, okay, I'm going to put this here. I'm going to move this here. My opponent's going to do this. I'm going to do this to respond to it. And so a lot of games feel like you're kind of just going through the motions. And then you come to a crux point like turn two, turn three, where you and your opponent have a big turn. And whoever's big turn, is the best. They win the game. And oftentimes you're like, okay, it's turn four, you're all dead or I'm all dead. Let's talk it out. So I think if they can make this new mission situation work really well, I'm excited for it to make the game a little more engaging on all 5 turns. And also, like I said, make list building and faction choices matter a lot more, and make people able to take, crazy wild lists and do well with them.
Yeah.
Um,
And
I'm hopeful. We'll
we're
see.
recording this on the day that they just previewed the first taste of the missions here. And by the time, some folks might be listening to this in like the next week or so, and more info might have come out. But we're basically operating today on just seeing a preview of, the five force dispositions, as well as just a couple samples of, how some of those play into different ones. I was going to say, Tom, how if I play devil's advocate here and I say, all right, 10th edition kind of felt like the missions, like there were certain army archetypes that excelled at so many of the missions that they obviously had an advantage over a lot of the other armies. Um,
Mhm.
you know, Beyond just overpowered stuff being, or overtuned stuff coming out, new items or just misbalanced stuff. I'm trying to think of what a good example of that might be, but um, there are certain armies that, like, if you were to think of like an army disposition, like the combination of army dispositions, looking at the rules or the preview that they had, I start to think about, will the game coalesce down to just kind of like this narrow corridor of stuff that is just so good mathematically. Like, is Art of War going to come out and say, okay, here mathematically are the missions you should be playing with,
Mhm.
this subset of armies, and like this is the most optimum way, and it has these matches and permutations into everything else. Are we going to get to that where over like 3 months or 4 months, we'll get a legit, just like we did in 10th, we'll get a legitimate creativity cycle where there's all sorts of ideas floating around there, but they all just kind of coalesce down to like this smaller box of this is what wins, this is what works, and everybody just kind of like follows and jumps on those trains. I'm curious whether you think like what you've seen so far, if 11th edition will likely play out that way.
Well, I really hope not. Obviously, I think if the design team can do it the right way and do their job well and balance them, I think we this if they can get this system right, I think there is a really good chance that we don't quite have that kind of meta that where everyone like knows this is the list you play. Like I'm imagining that, maybe not with Thousand Suns, because we don't have a very big roster of units, but with armies that have more like options in terms of like what they can run. Like a CSM is a great example. They have a melee wing, they have a vehicle wing, they have like a fast attack wing. If they can make it so you have proper detachment support for these smaller sections of the army, and they make it so that you can like that actual missions, like if purrs the foe rewards you enough for focusing on damage, and that would be really good. I do think the problem is, though, like you said, um, if we have a poorly balanced mission setup when we get 11th out, I do think we run a very big risk of everyone being like, okay, these are cool, but I just want to run take and hold. And then you're playing the same mission for 5 rounds of a tournament.
Mhm.
And you're like, this is really, really boring. So I think it comes down to how well the balance team and design team can make this work. I'm cautiously optimistic because they've kind of done a pretty good job of balancing the game after, uh, like during 10th. I am worried though that we're either going to have like I think if the most likely scenario in my mind is that we get to July of this year and we have the rules, we have the new detachment rules, we have all these new detachments, and you probably sit down and you realize, okay, these are cool, but these two or these three are clearly the best three, and there's no reason to take these two. But I do think that when that happens, which it probably will, I think they've introduced least so far, enough variables they can like turn knobs and push buttons and pull levers in the the imaginary command space that they occupy. They can do enough tweaks that they might be able to fix that. Um, but we'll see. I'm hopeful, but I would agree that there's a big risk where if they get this wrong and they don't balance it properly,
Yeah.
then we're gonna have problems because if it does have the possibility of like if we get there and that happens, this game becomes a very stale and samey game. Like
Yeah.
because the one big benefit of the current tournament setup is that tournament TOs like myself and everybody else can, make sure that you aren't playing the same map and the same mission every single day. And they can introduce, a curveball here or there. Like maybe they put on there in my area, my local TOs, bless their hearts, love to put one round of supply drop somewhere in the tournament, which I despise because I always go first on supply drop and I can't win very easily that way. But that is a good way of like spicing things up. And I think this new system would eliminate that ability from TOs. So a
Uh-huh.
lot more of that responsibility falls on the game designers to get it right.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Yeah, I was thinking about this and that you're likely going to, like in their article they were saying very very clearly that for tournaments you're going to lock in what your force disposition is, so your list
Yeah.
and your force disposition are going to be locked in. It also sounds like your leaders are going to be locked in, and
Yep.
we don't really know. There's probably some other aspects. They've changed so much so far with list design that there's probably some other aspects of it that are changing that um, might be like things like when you're combining detachments, are you only getting certain numbers of stratagems for each one? So like in your list, you have to kind of pick which stratagems you're rolling with, which on one side I think is different and interesting, and I'm willing to give that a go. But it harkens kind of back to if you remember in ninth edition, we had to specify what psychic powers units had,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. I remember that.
the bookkeeping kind of picks up again. And maybe they're looking at this like, okay, well, we over corrected a little bit too much on the bookkeeping with your lists, and that now they're so simple that we can start opening that back up and the customizations up a little bit more. But if you're locking in your force disposition, the thing I kind of worry about is, they've always had this problem with balance where they will have to balance something because there's a narrow set of rules that you can run for a list or a detachment. Like let's take the Forge Fiend as an example in Chaos Space Marines. Like it's good with dark packs. Um, you can have other way, like if you put it in Soul Forge, it gets even more, right? you
Yeah.
have you have this kind of situation that exists all over the place in 40K where a model has to get balanced, because if you take it in this other detachment, it becomes all of a sudden a real big problem for the game. And now that you're locking in like how your list is going to play, I think about it from that perspective of, if I have like a Custodes army, and that Custodes army, they get the points and everything tuned away that Custodes can just play take and hold so dominantly that no other armies really have it. Like that combination becomes a problem. So then do they then balance the points on Custodes based on that, which then wrecks them potentially in the other detachments? And even in Thousand Suns, you could make the same analogy. If it's like, okay, Magnus in his detachment is ridiculously overpowered, but in the other detachments he's pretty much worthless. So where, do you point him for the worst case or the best case? Or you know it's it's going to be interesting to see how they actually balance this out. um that's kind of the big thing I see, in that some armies, like when I was reading this article, the thing that stuck out to me looking at the was it the Death Trap secondary that they had up there,
Mm.
I was just thinking that this is like, okay, this was their answer to Space Marines running like Vanguard Spearhead with a bunch of Phobos, right? And you're
Mhm.
you're trying to play the sneaky army essentially that runs around and does missions. Um,
Mhm.
and that's what this feels like, which is cool because I look at this and I go, okay, yeah, there's a way to play the army and score primary now without
Mhm.
having to kill stuff. But I do
Yeah,
remember back at 10th edition when it launched, there were similar statements made and there were similar ways of looking at the game, thinking I could play the game that way, but killing isn't going to really matter as much because look, you could table in some situations, you can table your opponent and the person who got tabled can still win. The
yeah,
reality is killing still tends to be the way that everybody ends up leaning. So I almost feel
yeah.
like when 11th launches, like Purge the Foe, Reconnaissance, those are if I had to guess, Reconnaissance, Purge the Foe, and Take and Hold are going to be the three that are just kind of like the very strong dispositions that everybody runs because
Yeah, I
they
would.
fit what people do today.
Yeah, I would be very shocked if Purge the Foe is not a very popular mission in 10th, 11th edition. It's like you said, we play a war game. At the end of the day, missions matter and, objectives matter a lot. But if you kill your opponent before they kill you, generally speaking, you're going to
Right.
have an advantageous time. So if you can just say, hey, I'm playing like in Thousand Suns, for example, right now we have to run like 10 to 20 Zangors on foot, 2 to 3 Zangor enlightened, and like a spawn or a Sekatar, because we have to be like, okay, I have to have something to go and do like area denial or establish locus or hold my expansion for a turn. But if I can just say, hey man, I am playing Purge the Foe, I get 4 points for holding my home point all game, and the rest of my game is I get points for murdering you, and I just take like 20 Scarab Cult Terminators, Magnus, 2 Defilers, and like 4 Squads or Root Marines. I just say, this is coming to you and killing you, and I'm going to win the game that way. That might be a very dangerous design and philosophy to have. We'll see. But I would agree, it's definitely a risk they run with this new system. Um, and I think the big thing is that, like you said, we have had a history. Like I think back to ninth edition when I first started playing. There was this little thing called Necrons, where they give every single Necron model OBSEC, and so a Scarab could walk onto the point and hold it instead of 20 cultists, and that was very broken and very very good. And if it sounds like this, we might be shifting back design wise to something where that could be a problem again. But like you said, we have an edge case where maybe a certain army has the right volume of the proper unit to make something just impossible to counter. We already kind of have that with some recon guard builds and other things like that, where they don't really care about actually fully killing you. It's just like, okay, I have 2 billion bodies of OC3, but I'm just going to sit here, and yeah, you're going to kill them, but you can't kill them fast enough to win the game. And I do have enough to like kill some of your stuff too. So we'll see. I am
Man,
cautiously optimistic
I
because
sure hope they don't go back to like the OBSEC model because that was I thought one of the best the objective control thing, even though it took a little bit of like a learning curve, I thought that was the best change that they made in 10th
I
edition. Like
agree.
one of the core changes in the game that was probably for the best.
Yeah, I think the change to OC, beside not OBSEC, just cleared up so much bookkeeping and made life just so much easier
Yeah.
for a lot of people to play the game. Because now you're not worried about, oh, my tactical marine has OBSEC and yours doesn't, so I get to hold this point even though you have 30 guys, I have one guy. Speaking of objectives, though, terrain being objectives is gonna be interesting. I don't know how I feel about it yet because I haven't seen anything fully about it yet. Hopefully, by the time you guys are hearing this, you have more information than we do now. But um, my knee jerk reaction is, oh boy, Rubric Marines are gonna love this. Um, but I guess we'll see. What are your thoughts on that change, on the removal of markers and making it terrain instead?
Honestly, I like it. I just haven't like exactly how you were framing it. We haven't seen the full picture of how it's implemented in the game, but I
Mhm.
really like the idea of hey, now the first 5 to 10 minutes of the game is not me measuring objectives and talking with my opponent while I do that and like
Hmm.
multitasking and everything. It's like I don't have to do that anymore. And I just think about
Yeah.
like from like a tournament perspective, that was one of the worst parts was you had to rush to your table so that you didn't spend all your
Mhm.
time like setting up everything and I really, really like the idea of not having to do that and that we can just, get started and just start playing. I do think that there is going to have to be some scrutiny around how they implemented it. Cert the way
Yeah.
they do objectives, like there's all sorts of questions floating around there, like, well, what counts for being in the terrain and holding it, or like can a vehicle just roll up and just tow in? Like how does all that kind of stuff start to work out? We'll see when they start to give us previews on it, but those are the kinds of things I'm thinking about. But I mean, in general, I think it's a good change for the game in the long run, even if it means, hey, it's a little rough early on. Maybe there's some things they haven't thought about that have to be kind of worked out in an FAQ. We'll
Mhm.
get to a better spot, I think, over 6 months or so than where we
Yeah.
are, I think today.
I'm hopeful for it too. I think if nothing else, it opens the door for making a 40K game a little more thematic,
Yeah.
which I get that people who play tournaments like me and you, if we want to focus more on making it a balanced competitive experience. But at the end of the day, if it also can be thematic, I'm definitely here for that. And I think it's one of the things. It's another one of the things with it. If they have this system set up properly, it's another lever they can pull to balance the game. And I think if they do it right, the more levers that they can access to make small tweaks to how the game is played and balance it that way, I think is very nice. Because right now in 10th, you basically have two ways to balance a broken strategy or unit. You either make the points for those units go up a lot, or you completely change the rules that are applied to the units. If you could instead like tweak the way that a objective works, like maybe it's a smaller ruin now, or you could instead tweak like, hey, this play style with this disposition is too broken. Let's make the detachment that gives you that disposition cost more detachment points, so you can't super it as much. Having those options of like pulling things and adjusting things, I think gives the balance team more ways to make sure things aren't broken, and it's a positive change in my opinion. Hopefully they do it right, and that's true when we get to it. But I guess we'll see.
I guess the other thing we've heard in 11th, I don't think we've fully confirmed everything on this yet, but cover sounds like it's changing to be something like -1 to your ballistic skill.
Yeah,
And
I'm gonna be very curious to see how that works. 'Cause I think like the problem is like a lot of things like flamers, their big thing is I ignore cover. Well, now torrent guns are gonna ignore cover by being a torrent weapon. So what's gonna happen there? I don't know.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
I,
it'll
I
be
hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah, so like the thing is like I think it'd be a good change because I think right now um the the current way the game is balanced where you can like in some cases get like a plus you can ignore up to like 2 or 3 pips of armor piercing on a shot can make it very unfun. Like you shoot a las cannon at a tank and you get like 5 wounds, and they say, "Oh, smoke AOC. I save it on threes. I take no damage."
Yeah.
I don't think that should be how it works. I'd be much more comfortable with them reducing the ability to modify our AP and increasing the ways to modify, getting hits and getting wounds. So I think on paper, I'm a fan of this change, at least for now. We'll see if they execute it properly. But I do think that moving cover and its various benefits um, away from like making AP worse and instead making
Yeah.
ballistic skill worse is a good thing. Only problem with that though is that as of right now, there are a lot of armies in the game who are balanced around being a 4 plus ballistic skill base with a bunch of ways to increase that ballistic skill by
Right.
like buffs. So like Tau, for example.
Yep.
Um if this change goes through, there's a pretty good chance, if Tau keeps ignore cover on their guns, then suddenly Tau is very busted. If they don't, then suddenly Tau is hitting on fives. And that's not great for Tau.
No.
So we'll see.
No, and then you have guard, you've got orcs. Those are all
Yep.
just other armies
Mhm.
that come to mind that are in similar situations. So, and Nids
And
probably as
then
well.
it's also the fact of like there is definitely a world probably where you can probably stack enough buffs to get somebody to be hitting on sevens. Like, is that going to be a thing, or you're going to have sixes always hit? I don't know. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
It'll be weird.
Yeah. I mean, definitely. It'll come down to how they update the rules essentially for a lot of this stuff, just like
Mhm.
the ignore cover stuff. Because if you just take the game as it is today and you just say, okay, cover now is a -1 to your ballistic skill instead of +1 to your save, you also are able to stack that with stealth in theory, because stealth is a -1 to hit, or anything else that, like smoke, for example, that gives you a -1 to hit penalty. Now you're at
Or like,
-2 to hit.
yeah, or like Death Guard, where they have smoke and cover, and also make your ballistic skill worse with their contagion.
Right.
Now you're at -3 to hit. Like,
Right.
what do you do, right?
Yep. And that's always been, I mean, even going back to ninth edition, we had or maybe it was eighth edition, that we had the minus to hit shenanigans with Eldar and all their planes and everything.
Mhm.
And,
Mhm.
it definitely is kind of like, I feel like if they set the game up where that stuff is like if you just naturally say, okay, every time you're going to shoot, you're at like a -1 to hit penalty because cover is handed out as liberally as it is in 10th edition,
Mhm.
then I can see a lot of other people trying to say, well, how do I stack more stuff on that? And just like that's your stat check into me is -3. Let me see how many other things I can find to make it like even worse, where it's not just minus 3, then I've got minus AP, and then I've got all sorts of other bonuses stacked with it. So
Mhm.
again, that's just going to be a matter of how they roll that out. But I was thinking about the fact that, I mean, hell, your rubric Marines, they were saying, look, you can go sit in an objective. If you can infiltrate like you can today, like 10 rubric Marines with all flamers, and you just
Mhm.
say, okay, I'm just going to infiltrate these things up. And there's this new rule, somehow you can hand it out to them where they can sit there and not be targeted. They get like mini lone op or
Mhm.
whatever, and they're just sitting
Mhm.
there. It's a 12-inch range on those flamers. You move them up, you warp
Yeah.
or surge them up again, and like you instantly are in a spot where like now infiltrating becomes a little bit more powerful in the game. You don't have to worry about, well, I'm just throwing these guys away. That just
On
gets really interesting.
Yeah, even more so, I have heard there was a rumor. I don't think this was confirmed, but one of the rumors that we've heard thus far is that Overwatch is being taken away. I have no idea if that is true because they haven't talked about it on the Warcom yet. But if that is not the case, and we keep Overwatch in its current form,
Yeah.
like you said, a squad of that infiltrated in, like with an Infernal Master, with a 18-inch flamer.
Yeah.
Now you can't shoot me unless you're within 15, and I can overwatch you when you get there with a super strong flamer. That's pretty strong, and that's gonna be interesting because we're gonna see how things end up. I think the knee jerk reaction, everyone thinks that's a big buff for melee. I'm not sure it really is because I think most of the time, if you're playing a melee army and you're in a ruin, you're probably behind the wall anyway.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's actually a bigger buff for fast shooting armies. Like I could park my if I'm playing Eldar, I can park my fire dragons, for instance, in a ruin and measure out so you can't get within 15 of me to shoot them. And then I can toss them like 15 inches towards you and shoot you.
Yep.
And that just makes it has the potential to make things a lot more dangerous for some armies. We'll see how it goes.
I think
Um,
the
yeah.
melee part. I see a lot of people, and I'm one of them who thinks the rules that are coming out so far are leaning towards it being a melee edition. Like there's plenty of things saying, well, if that's the case, then yeah, that's another benefit to melee armies. But I think
Yeah.
the ultimate, for me, the ultimate indicator on whether it is, all in on melee or not is the terrain layouts that we get. And that
Yep.
really will tell you whether that's going to work or not. And generally speaking, I will say that GW does a very good job on their terrain layouts, and that they
Yeah.
generally are very balanced. I'd say in 10th edition, while you'd probably say it's a shooty edition, shooting always tends to have a little bit of an advantage. But
Mhm.
we've seen here in the last like 6 to 8 months, Blood Angels have been doing very well. World Eaters have constantly been a very decent army throughout the whole edition. They've had some times where they're really good and sometimes where maybe they're not as where they should be. They should be stronger. But all in all, it just kind of has evened out. And Thousand Sons have seen their times where they shoot really, really well, and we don't really have much melee in general.
Yeah.
So we really haven't had to participate at all in that. But I would say overall, it's been relatively a balanced edition where I've never felt like shooting was so oppressive that you could never play your melee army. And I've never felt like melee was so good. Like there were times in ninth edition with Custodes where they were so good and so fast that you had nothing you could do against it.
Mhm.
They just zoomed up the table. If you didn't kill them in one turn, you were dead. Especially Rubric Marines and stuff. So yeah,
Yeah.
I have hope in the layouts that they're going to be pretty well balanced. And I've seen some things. I don't think it's actually confirmed, but I don't think they're changing the table sizes at all. But it sounds like they are changing some of the footprints for the terrain, and it sounds
Yeah.
like they're
So
changing some of
I've heard,
the ruins on there.
I've heard that, like you said, the table size isn't changing. But I think I heard somewhere. I'm not sure if this is confirmed or not, but I heard they're going or up from we're currently at like 14, I think, mats of like terrain layout mats on the table, and I
Hmm.
thought I heard they're going to increase that to 16, not 14. So
Okay.
two more pieces of terrain on every table, which does seem to suggest that there will be more places to hide.
Yeah.
I do think I agree that the Games Workshop layouts, at least most of them, are pretty well balanced. There are like three or four of them that are really good. Like layout
Layout
one is
seven.
great. I actually think layout seven right now is actually pretty okay. It's like with the current race. Layout 6 and 8 and 3 are the big ones where it's like, oh, that's probably not good for the game. But I do think more of them are good enough balance wise than are bad. And if your tournament organizer is smart, they'll pick the right ones. If they're not smart, they'll say, here's 3 rounds of 6 and 3 rounds of 4. And you'd be like, oh no. But I do think I agree in general that the layouts, and then like before the Europeans get all mad at me, I'm coming from a place where early in 10th edition, before we had these Games Workshop layouts, and also in 9th edition, the way that the US in my area did terrain was player placed terrain. So compared to that horrible stuff, I am going to play and praise the Games Workshop layouts every time, because compared to that nightmare,
Yeah.
we are in paradise with Games Workshop layouts. If you haven't ever experienced player placed terrain, count yourself lucky. It was not fun.
No.
Basically, it was like you told your player base, hey, I know you're here to play 40K, but how about you play chess first and then play 40K on the chessboard? And so you
Yeah.
had to like learn a whole different like game and meta game of placing terrain, and then you were to play a game of 40K. And if you did the first meta game wrong, you would lose 40K almost automatically. So again, nothing that Games Workshop has put out so far has made me want player place terrain back, and so I am a full supporter of Games Workshop terrain for that reason. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I thought LVO when we had to do player place terrain was it was rough. It just could have been a lot better. And what was terrible is that there were even some events, if I remember right, where there were some tables that some TOs still hung on to like their own layouts. Like
Hmm.
they kept the
Hmm.
GW layouts, but then they had some of their own layouts because of their terrain that they had. I think by now most of the events that I've experienced in the last like basically for 10th edition have pretty much all gone all in on the GW layouts. And I
Hmm.
hope eventually we can get to a place where everybody is using the same terrain. It is still kind of a frustration of mine that, we still get like for team events and things that those have their own special layouts and even some singles
Yeah.
tournaments layouts out there. They still kind of have their own things that are in there. And it's
Yeah.
not that it's not at the end of the day, it's kind of like, look, you do what you want to do, that I get, but for like competitive singles events, if we're looking at stats, we're looking at the balance of the game, like that stuff, especially big events, it's gotten so important, for the balance of the game and how we use stats and how GW looks at the stats and everything. And if you're using different terrain layouts or things like that, we get all sorts of like weird skewed results or things that work in that layout, or it kind of makes it a lot of extra work to try and figure out, okay, if someone was running this list with like 60 rubric marines, we later find out, oh, it was like a WTC style layout that they had, and the 60 rubric marines worked because nothing was shooting at them. Okay, cool.
Yep. Yeah.
But yeah, on the GW tables, you generally wouldn't run into that. So I hope maybe we don't get there this edition, but I hope the inevitability is that we see more of a standardization across the board on that stuff and keep moving in that direction.
Yeah, I hope so too. I think that it would just be better for the game as a whole if we could all agree on a terrain format. I think the biggest problem with the current way it works was like three main metas: Games Workshop terrain, WTC terrain, and UKTC terrain. It's just like it makes it harder for a newer competitive player to break into the scene because you want to do research and figure out what worked for folks. And I think there's a big pitfall where if you try and run a successful list on a certain terrain format on the different terrain format, they aren't very compatible every time, and it can be very disheartening. And
Hmm.
I think also just in general, if we can unify a terrain format for the whole game, then it does a lot to bring the community more together. um, I think there's a section of the 40K community in all three of those metas who is like believes that theirs is superior and that the other two don't count. I know I've heard that from some players where it's like I talk about how I did this with a terrain format in GW, and they say, "Oh, well, that's games workshop terrain. That doesn't count." And I'm like, okay, well, that's what we play over here, so it
Yeah.
kind of does count. But I think if we can get rid of that elitism by just making sure we all play the same terrain,
Yeah.
that makes the game better and lowers the toxicity, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah. I
Um,
couldn't agree more. But we'll see what happens in 11th. We still have to find out what they're going to do with the layouts and everything. Before we wrap things up here, obviously we need to talk about the new Defiler. Um,
yes, the crab.
yeah. So my takes have been probably a little spicy on this, but I think in general I'm high on the Defiler as a model. I
Mhm.
think this is one of the best models they've come out with in a while. If you look at
Oh, for sure.
all the different bits that are in there, it looks good. It like when you
Hmm.
look at it, you go, yeah, that's a Defiler. That's what it should look like. Uh, that and all the guns they added to it are great.
Hmm.
The the profiles and the special rules on them, I feel like in my mind, I'm hoping that what it was just a temporary stopgap until 11th gets here, and then a whole bunch of stuff kind of gets rebooted and updated with new rules, things like that. We'll see what happens, but I think right now my stance is, I'm buying two defilers. They're not going to get used to my Thousand Sons army. They're going to my Vashtor army. And I think if you're really big on defilers, and you really want to run them in Thousand Suns, you can find a way to do it for sure. But I feel like
Mhm.
it's probably competing with the Vindicator in terms of its
Yeah.
role, and that it wants to get forward, it wants to bully the other armies. And honestly, I think the Vindicator just does a better job.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a hierarchy of defilers. Like you said, the CSM defiler is amazing. It's one of the best models and data sheets for CSM that they could have gotten. It solves a lot of their problems they've had for a while, which is they lack a lot of quality long range shooting. And this defiler just completely fixes that problem. Um, the fact they can walk through walls for free is amazing.
Yeah,
That fixes a lot of problems with them.
no battle shock
And then,
tests, nothing like that. It's just
yeah,
you just get to walk right through the wall.
you just crab walk right through them. And also, I think the Death Guard Defiler is going to see a lot of play. It takes away cover from an army that already kind of takes away cover with contagions. So those are two big ones. Emperor's Children is going to love that crab because it's again fixes a problem where until now they've had no long range anti tank, and now they do, and it's pretty good. So I think I'd put the Thousand Sons Defiler either in third place or fourth place of all the defilers in the game, because I definitely think the CSM one is definitely better. Um, the Emperor's Chosen one is going to see a lot of play, but that whether that's because it's the only option or the best option, it remains to be seen. And the Death Guard one is probably going to see a lot of play too. I do think that the Thousand Sons Defiler for 250 points, you do get a good volume of shooting and melee. And you also, with the Feel No Pain, get a good amount of durability. And then when you factor in that we can give it +2 move with Magnus and make it go 14. And then if we need to, we can give it Surge for an extra 6 inches of movement. And it can get places and be annoying. I think it's at least something that we detest. I don't think it's busted out of the gate. I don't think it's horrible out of the gate. I need to get some test games in and see how I feel about it. Um, but I do think it is not the best defiler in the bunch, and there are better places to play defilers. And we'll see if it takes the place of two Vindicators because Vindicators are pretty good.
Yeah,
And it is hard in a lot of Thousand Sons lists to find that many points without cutting things that you really don't want to cut.
yeah.
I have a list that I'm looking at right now in Grand Coven where I take my 4 rubric coven list and I cut one of the rubric squads and I cut a piece of chaff and I put a defiler in their place. And I'm going to see how that goes. On paper, it does seem like it might be a solid choice because it just gives me a big scary threat that I can put out first, and I can draw things out for Magnus and Terminator to pounce on. But the big thing that I'm very sad about the Defiler is that it's still on that big 160 millimeter base, and for Thousand Suns specifically, it's a very sad fact because do you know how many inches 160 millimeters is?
No, I don't.
It is 6.2, which means we are zero point 0.2 inches away from being able to surge the defiler through a wall. Because right now,
Oh my
it's the
God.
base is too big, so you can't cast temporal surge and you can't clear the wall with the 6-inch movement you get, which is very sad. So that is a big thing where I'm like, well, that makes it a lot harder to move it around now.
Now, do
Um,
we know for sure that it's on the 160? Have we seen that
we
confirmed?
do, I'm pretty sure. I think we have confirmation that it's on the 160 still. I don't think they have written down that it's on the 160, but I'm pretty sure the product information for the Defiler went
Gotcha.
up on somewhere. And I think the shops that have access to the product information for online sales have found that it does include a 160 millimeter base, sadly. So
Oh, it's rough.
yeah,
That is rough.
that's tough. It's tough. Um, which is just that fact makes it. I think if it was small enough that it could surge through a wall, I think we get a lot more excited over in Thousand Suns Land,
Yeah.
because then we can just like move it and then walk through a wall and shoot with it.
Well,
But
I'll say
as it
there's still
stands, yeah,
yeah, I'd say there's still the option of maybe using rapid ingress with it and
yeah,
maybe having some fun with that, where you get a
mhm,
full movement turn and then throw a surge on top of that. But I think you
yeah,
really aren't going to be surging because you're going to want to be charging with it. And so you're
yeah.
probably going to just want to go over the wall. If I remember right, is there an advance and charge strat for vehicles in the Warforged detachment?
Oh, I don't know, but I can check right now. I
I
don't
f-
think
I
so.
I feel like it's like a fall. I might be thinking about the fallback and charge for the Rubric Marines and Phalanx, but
um,
if you could advance and charge, or you could fall back and charge with it, that
there
like
is a 1 CP fallback shoot and charge, but don't
okay,
think there's an advanced shoot and charge. Yeah, no advanced shoot and charge.
because
Still, fallback shoot and charge is pretty good.
at the end of the day, I like if I see a list that's a Warforged list and it's got a Defiler in there, like I don't sit there and go, oh, why did they take a Defiler? No, it makes
Oh
sense
yeah,
to me, and I'm kind of like, yeah, okay, that works. If it's a
yeah,
Phalanx list and you've got a Defiler in there, I'm going, what are you doing? Or
yeah,
like even in Grand Coven, like you've got concessions you have to make on your list, like you were saying, where you
yeah.
have to start.
Mhm.
That's where our biggest problem is. So
Oh, and the special rule that we got for our Defiler
yeah,
looks very good on paper. It's a good Overwatch, but we are also the Overwatch army. So
that's
I'm
right.
not really excited about the Overwatch because I don't think it's going to come up that often unless I force it to happen, right? Like if I'm playing a game where turn one, I shove my defiler forward and I shoot with it, and then I say, okay, I am going to Overwatch with this big ass defiler here,
Hmm.
and then I engineer it to happen. Great. But I don't think if we're playing a normal game of 40K and you get to your movement phase, and I'm like, I have a Defiler or I have an Infernal Master with 5 rubrics. There's not very many cases where I'm picking the Defiler over the Infernal Master to
Exactly.
Overwatch with. And so it does kind of a do nothing, not do nothing, but it's kind of a lackluster special rule for us because we already have so many good Overwatch options in Thousand Suns,
Yep.
um, which is kind of sad. But I
But I
do
guess
think
there's
at
hope there.
two, yeah,
If Overwatch goes away in 11th edition, then they've got to do something for the units that are all built around that. So,
that
I
is
could see some
true. I
hope
didn't think
there
about that.
that something would change. So,
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing is like at 250 points, you do, I think, get 250 points worth of shooting and melee. I think you get the guns and the volume of fire where it is you get your points worth from its shooting and its melee. I just think, like you said, the things you have to cut to add one to a
right.
Thousand Suns list make it make it at least you have to test it before you're sure. Like I need to get a game in before I can give a confident answer, but I would lean towards it being a more niche pick.
Yeah.
Like I think, like you know how like most people are not running the Vindicators, but Noah is having success with them. It might fall into it's not a meta pick, but if you build around it, you're going to have a good time, and we'll see.
Yeah.
Um,
And
I th-
I can see a world where you run two of them in Warforged, and
mhm.
then maybe you have a bunch of robots in your list, and then you
Yeah.
have two Defilers, and then maybe three Forge Fiends, and you probably still have room for some other stuff in there after all of that. Like so you just kind of have layers there where you've got Forge Fiends in the backfield shooting, you've got Defilers playing the midfield, and then your
Mhm.
robots just kind of working to get you space up front. So yeah, there's concepts there I can see where okay, this I can see how this works.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is like in Warforged, it's a really good pick because you have the rules to support it.
Right.
Giving the Defiler rerolls is really nice. Giving it +1 to wound is very nice. And
Right.
having options for giving it aid is pretty good. So yeah, and I think the other thing is like you said, Warforged, I think with the Defiler and the Secretary robots, I think has enough support now where if it turns out the Defiler is as good as it might look to some people on paper, then I think Warforged might jump up in the kind of the detachment tier list. I'd put it solidly, I think, in like third or fourth best detachment right now. I think if it gets this, like, if the Defiler is as good as it looks on paper in Warforged, I could see Warforged jumping up to be in the top three with, Coven and Phalanx and being a real option for playing the game. But I guess we'll see. I'm not sure if we'll see them outside of Warforged. I'm going to test it because it looks fun. But so I guess keep an eye out for my thoughts on it in about a couple weeks. But yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Well, speaking of that, just rapid fire here as we close out. Uh, what are you looking for in the rules that are coming out? You know, they're going to be previewing a bunch of stuff.
Yeah,
what are the things you're looking for most in those?
I am looking for, as a Thousand Sons player, they have talked about they're changing the way leaders work and that leaders always lead. And I want to figure out what that means because I think if that means that you keep the buff of the unit you're in until the character dies, like for instance, if an Infernal Master keeps rubric rerolls till it dies, that's very good for us. I also want to see they talked about stratagem stacking. And that worries me because I do think a lot of Thousand Sons, at least in Grand Coven and sometimes also in other factions, you want to be able to like say, okay, I have this much CP. I want to have the option of re-rolling my spell test and also giving Magnus, his super buff. So we'll see how that goes. But also, I do want to see. I want to see. So those are two. My third big thing. I want to see how what this like 70 detachment drop is going to look like, and also if they're going to actually go through with a fine-tooth comb and make like look at Thousand Suns for instance, like okay, warp meld is obviously not a 3-point detachment, make it 2 or make it 1, whereas Grand Coven definitely is a 3-point detachment. Or if they're just going to say all the Codex ones from 10th are all 3 points. You can't soup with them. You can only soup with the new ones. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, on the detachment front, I think that's big because they've said, armies might not be keeping every single detachment that they have. Some might be going away.
Yeah.
I'm very curious what they decide to do with Grotness detachments, and whether they keep them or they just
Yeah, because they said that you keep your codexes, but they did not, like you said, they did not
right.
mention if that includes the other supplemental ones you've gotten besides your codexes ones. And
Yeah.
I know that some players, for instance, in Custodes land, might hear that and go, "Oh no, my codex sucks. That's horrible for me." um, Whereas maybe in Thousands, I'm not quite as worried about that. But um, we'll have to see how much they change. And I also think like they said they're going to keep the codex, but I'll be curious to see based on what they change with how cover works, how charge rules work, how certain things work. I'll be curious to see what, if any, of the codex rules get errated or fact, because if the changes are as cut and dry as cover is changing, then quite a few armies that have like ignores cover or gains the benefit of cover might need to be tweaked. We'll see.
Yeah. Yep. So we'll probably have to get back together here in the next couple weeks to review the next wave of stuff that comes out.
Yeah.
Defilers are going up this weekend for pre-order. I know that at some point here very soon they're going to start getting real close to releasing some of the new rules because what is it,
Yeah.
June? So June we have the Edmonton Open coming up, and then in
Mm.
July is the um, that's Tacoma. I have a suspicion that May is Dallas in the U.S.
Mhm.
or these are the GW events. I have a
Yes. Yes.
feeling that the Dallas event is probably going to be too early for them to run 11th edition at, but you
Yeah.
never know. I mean, they could just come out with the rules. Here you go. And even though the new box comes out sometime in June, they could just drop the new rules in May. Just say, look,
Yeah.
it's live, and we're just going to run it for all three tournaments. And honestly,
I mean,
that'd be exciting.
yeah, I think there's a decent chance that we almost certainly in July are running 11th edition by then. I'd be shocked if you don't had that by then.
Yeah.
And we'll see. Yeah, Tacoma in Edmonton in June is my big thing. I'm not sure if May will be soon enough to make it work, but I think it's a chance Edmonton might be on new rules.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Well,
Because yeah,
yeah, we'll see. I mean, it's all just kind of up to what GW decides to do, and
hmm
they've had a history of sometimes they'll move things forward a month or move things back a month. I think 10th edition launched at Tacoma, if I remember right, and
yeah, yeah.
that was at least the first big tournament that was running it. It might have launched the week before or a little bit before that, but they have to
Yeah.
make sure that there's enough time for players to digest the information, play it a little bit in practice. So I would say at least 2 weeks ahead of that. And if they were
Mhm.
going to run it in May for Dallas, that would basically mean that they at the end of April they would release 11th edition, and we're probably a little too early for that. That's like in the next like
Yeah.
3 or 4 weeks for that to come out. That would be pretty
That's real
aggressive.
soon.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
you never. Yeah, I mean, hey, you never know. I haven't
Indeed, you
seen
never know.
anything mentioned about a spring like balance update or anything. We just got one, what, in January that just came out with a
Yeah.
bunch of updates, right? I don't think we got one in March.
We
So,
did get one in March.
did we get one in March?
Think we got one. We got one. We got an official balanced data slate, I think,
Gotcha.
in the second week of March. It wasn't very eventful. It didn't do
Yeah.
very much, but it was there. And then obviously we got the second round of that this past week, which was nice. But yeah, it's going to be interesting. We're going to have to see if we have another balance patch before we get to 11th, or we're just going to ride with it. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, Tom, obviously, Magnus didn't do anything wrong, and I
Never.
I really appreciate you taking the time to come on here. We'll have to have you on again. Maybe have some other folks on here with us as well, and get
Yeah.
more opinions on this, and just kind of digest the 11th edition rules as they come out.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. If you want to, if you are listening and you want to find me, I am on the Thousand Sons Discord and of various other Discords as Niv NIV, most places. So you can find me there. And if you're in the Kansas City area and you want to find me there, come find me. I am at a bunch of events across the KC Metro. So if you're going to an event in Kansas City, you'll probably see me there. So come say hi.
Awesome. Well, we'll see you guys soon.